You are about to receive Buddhist teachings that will quiet your mind and carry you into deep sleep. Not eventually. Tonight. The Buddha taught that a mind trained in loving kindness sleeps in comfort, wakes in comfort, and dreams no evil dreams. That teaching is over 2,500 years old. It still works. He also identified, with precise clinical clarity, the 5 mental states that prevent deep sleep and gave a specific antidote for each one. He described the exact quality of awareness that dissolves restlessness without effort. He taught monks who could not sleep in frightening forests how to turn toward what scared them until the fear simply stopped. These teachings were chanted at bedsides for healing for over 2,000 years across Southeast Asia, Tibet, China, and Japan. Tonight you will receive them, not as philosophy, not as religion, as what they always were, practical instructions for a mind that will not stop, from teachers who understood that problem better than anyone who has ever lived. Each teaching arrives through a story that makes it land in the body, not just the thinking mind. A mountain in a storm, a monk alone in a dark forest, a woman who spent her whole life sitting directly above an inexhaustible treasure. Every image is authentic. Every teaching is real. Get comfortable now and lie down if you can. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whether it is late and the house is finally quiet, or early and the day has not yet found you, you are exactly where these teachings are meant to arrive. The lightning comes first, then the sound, a crack so deep it seems to split the valley in two. Rain hits the stone path outside the monastery window like 10,000 small fists, and the wind has been howling for 2 full days without pause. Trees on the lower slopes bend until their crowns brush the ground. Branches crack and fall. The small wooden structures on the hillside shudder against the full weight of the sky. Everything that can move is moving. Everything that can be unsettled is being unsettled. And the mountain does not move. It does not brace itself. It does not lean into the storm or away from it. Lightning strikes its face, not once but again and again, and the rock absorbs each blow without flinching. Water streams down its sides in fast white rivers that appear out of nowhere and vanish by morning. The wind throws everything it has against those ancient walls of stone, and the mountain simply receives it all and remains exactly what it was before the first cloud gathered. There is a pair of eyes watching this from a rain-streaked window. A young monk. He traveled for many days to reach this monastery in the northern mountains, through difficult terrain and uncertain weather, because he had heard about the teacher who lived here. People said this teacher was untouched by difficulty. That criticism did not move him. That praise did not inflate him. That even physical pain seemed to pass through him without leaving the residue it leaves in most people. The young monk wanted to know how. He had tried many things. Nothing had worked. When he arrived and bowed before the teacher and asked to be shown the path to inner peace, He expected detailed instruction. Instead, the teacher pointed through the window at the mountain across the valley and said, "Watch it during the next storm. Do not meditate. Do not practice any technique. Just watch." The storm arrived the next morning, and the monk took his place at the window. He had come because he was exhausted by his own reactivity. A sharp word from another monk could ruin his concentration for an entire day. Unexpected noise pulled him immediately out of whatever stillness he had managed to build. He felt most of the time like a leaf caught in moving air, carried wherever the next disturbance decided, with no say in the matter. He wanted stability. He wanted to become the kind of person that things moved around rather than through. The mountain was showing him something he could not quite name, because the mountain was not stable in the way he had imagined stability. He had assumed stability meant being closed off, building walls thick enough that nothing could penetrate. But the mountain had no walls. It was completely open to the storm. The rain fell on it without obstruction. The lightning found it without resistance. The wind moved across its entire face without anything blocking the contact. And still, none of it changed the mountain. Nothing that passed through it stayed. Nothing that struck it left a mark that altered what the mountain fundamentally was. The storm passed through. The mountain remained. The Buddha said something about the mind that very few people encounter. He said the mind, in its natural state, is luminous. The word he used meant bright, clear, shining of itself, not because of good conditions, not because of pleasant experience, but as a quality intrinsic to awareness itself, the way a clean mirror reflects light, not because the light is kind to it, but because that is simply what a clean mirror does. He said that anger, fear, grief, and restlessness are visitors. They come to the mind. They move in, sometimes quietly, sometimes with considerable force. They stay for a while. They leave. But they are not the mind itself. They are weather moving through a sky that remains, underneath all of it, fundamentally clear. The sky does not become the cloud. The mind does not become the anger. What they are, and what passes through them, are two completely different things. Sit quietly with your own experience for a moment, and you will see this is true. Thoughts are arriving right now. You did not construct them deliberately. They came on their own. Some will leave before this sentence ends. You are not doing the leaving either, but something in you is watching all of it. The arriving, the staying, the going, and that something is never the thought itself. It was here before the thought came. It will be here after the thought goes. That is the witness the Buddha was pointing at. The Chan master Hongji, who lived in 12th century China, spent his entire teaching life trying to describe this quality. He called it silent illumination, not silent in the sense of empty, and not illumination in the sense of dramatic awakening, but a steady, clear, luminous awareness that receives everything without grasping any of it. Aware of the storm, undisturbed by it, present to everything, possessed by nothing. This is what the mountain demonstrates. Not numbness, not distance. A full, open, luminous presence that remains itself regardless of what moves through it. When the storm finally passed, the young monk found his teacher in the garden, tending small plants that had been battered by 2 days of wind. The morning air was clean and cold, and smelled of pine and wet stone. The teacher looked up. "What did you see?" The monk was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The mountain did not try to stop the lightning. It did not try to redirect the rain. It let the storm be completely what it was, and stayed completely what it was at the same time. When the storm left, nothing about the mountain had changed." "Yes," said the teacher, "you came wanting to become unshakable. But the mountain is not unshakable because it mastered some technique. It is unshakable because it has never been confused about what it is. And in you, underneath the reactivity, underneath the exhaustion, underneath everything that today asked of you, there is something that works the same way." The monk stayed quiet. He felt something settle in him that had not settled in a long time. "Your fear tonight is real," the teacher said softly. "Your tiredness is real. Whatever is unresolved in you right now is real. But none of these things are what you are. They are weather. They will move. What watches them will still be here when the sky clears." This is the teaching that belongs to you tonight. There is something in you that has watched every difficult day you have ever lived through, every night that would not end, every fear that arrived uninvited at the worst possible hour. That something observed all of it without flinching. It was never broken by any of it. It is here right now, steady and clear, watching these words arrive and pass. The storm that visited this mountain lasted 2 days. Some storms in a human life last much longer. The teaching does not promise short storms. It says that what you are runs deeper than any storm that has ever moved through you. Let that be true right now. Not as an idea held in the mind, as something the body already knows. The mountain does not need to announce its stillness. It simply is what it is, through every season, through every storm the sky can produce. And as this night deepens, a quieter question begins to form, not about stillness, but about meaning. Because a life can be completely still inside and still feel empty. What makes that stillness worth something? What fills it with a sense that the day mattered, that the whole life has a direction worth following? The answer to that question has burned in a small lamp for 40 years, tended by one man who understood why it must never go out. "40 years is a long time to do the same thing every night. 40 years of winter storms and summer heat, of illness and health, of every kind of exhaustion a human body can produce. 40 years without a single exception." The monk Dogen, a quiet guardian in the hills near Kyoto, had lit the lamp in the temple hall every evening for 4 decades. He did not talk about this. He did not count the nights. He simply arrived at the lamp as the daylight changed, cleaned the wick, filled the oil, and touched the flame to it. And the light rose, as it always did, steady and warm, visible from the valley road far below. A merchant named Tishi arrived at the temple one spring afternoon, dusty from the road and curious about the man people in the valley spoke of with a particular kind of quiet reverence. Tishi was successful by every measure the world uses. He traded in silk and tea between the major cities, and he had built his business through sharp attention and relentless work. He was also, though he would not have used this word for it, empty, not unhappy exactly, just persistently aware that something was missing and unable to identify what it was. After a simple evening meal in the temple's small dining room, the two men sat together on a wooden veranda, watching darkness settle across the valley. Lights appeared below, one by one, then dozens, then hundreds, as families in the villages lit their evening fires and oil lamps. The valley filled slowly with small points of warmth against the dark. Tishi watched Dogon rise and light the temple lamp with the same unhurried care he had given it every night for 40 years. The flame caught and held, and its light spread across the veranda and out into the garden. "I want to ask you something," Tishi said. "You are clearly intelligent. You could have built a different kind of life. Why this? Why 40 years of the same lamp, the same path, the same small temple?" Dogon was quiet for a while, not because he did not have an answer, because the answer was something he had lived rather than thought, and putting it into words required care. "I do not experience this as a small life," he said, finally. "I experience it as the only life I have found where I go to sleep, knowing what the day was for." Tishi looked at the lamp, then at the lights in the valley below. "When I light this lamp," Dogon continued, "I am not doing it for myself. I am doing it for whoever is on that road tonight and needs to know there is a place up here, a merchant coming home late, a traveler who has lost her way, a farmer walking back from the fields in the dark. I will never meet most of them. I do not need to. The lamp reaches them whether I know their names or not." The merchant sat with this. In his own life, everything he had built was for himself, for his security, his reputation, his future. There was nothing wrong with any of that, but it meant the success of each day was measured entirely by what he had accumulated. And accumulation, he was beginning to understand, had a ceiling. You could only hold so much before the holding itself became a kind of weight. He had worked hard his entire adult life and had everything to show for it and nothing to come home to that felt like enough. The Buddha sent his first disciples out with a teaching that has not changed in 2,500 years. He said, "Go for the benefit of the many, for the happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world," not as an instruction in self-sacrifice, as a precise observation about where genuine peace is actually located. A mind turned entirely inward measuring every day by personal gain and personal loss, lives in constant calculation. A mind that has found something to serve beyond itself has a resting place that calculation cannot reach. This is not idealism. It is a description of how the mind actually works. When the purpose of your day is bigger than the day itself, the small irritations that would otherwise consume your thoughts lose their power. The unkind word from a colleague becomes less significant. The plan that failed becomes less catastrophic. Not because these things do not matter, but because they are held inside something larger that does not depend on any single day going well. Dogen slept well. This was not incidental. It was the direct result of knowing, each night, that the lamp was lit and the purpose of the day was complete. There was nothing left to rehearse. Nothing left to wonder whether he should have done differently. The act was complete. The lamp was burning. The rest belonged to the night. Tishi left the following morning and walked slowly down the mountain path toward the main road. At the bottom, he turned and looked back at the temple. He could no longer see the lamp from here, but he knew it was there. He thought about his own days, the transactions completed, the distances covered, the goods moved from one city to another, all of it purposeful, none of it pointing anywhere beyond itself. He had built a life that worked and did not feed him. That too is something the Buddha named directly. He taught that there is a happiness that comes from receiving, from acquiring what you want, from having things go the way you planned. And there is a deeper happiness that comes from giving, from contributing, something that continues to exist after you have turned away from it. The first kind of happiness is real. The second kind is different in nature. It does not depend on outcomes. It does not reverse when circumstances change. It rests on the act itself, which is already complete and cannot be undone. The act of giving without needing return is the only transaction the mind does not revisit at the end of the day. Consider what the day just past asked of you. Consider what you gave to it, not what you achieved, but what you offered. A moment of patience, an act of care that no one noticed, a word that helped and was not acknowledged, a decision to respond gently when you did not feel gentle. These things are not lost. They are the lamp already lit, already burning, already reaching someone on a road you will never walk. The lamp burns for whoever needs it, and Dogen never chooses his travelers. He simply keeps the light going. But what happens when someone arrives not needing light, but carrying anger, standing directly in front of you, insisting you take something you never agreed to hold? There is a teaching for exactly that moment, and it begins in a crowded marketplace, with a monk who understood something about ownership that most people spend their whole lives missing. You are standing at the edge of a market. Not any market in particular, the one your mind builds when it hears the word, color, and noise, and the smell of food cooking somewhere nearby. People moving in every direction with the particular urgency of people who have somewhere to be. Vendors calling out. Prices being argued over. The full press of human commerce moving around you like water around a stone. Into this scene walks a monk in a simple brown robe. You notice him because he is moving differently from everyone else. Not slowly exactly, deliberately. Each step placed with the quiet attention of someone who is completely present to where he is. He is here to buy rice and vegetables for his monastery, and he approaches each stall with the same unhurried care, picking up an item, feeling its weight, examining it closely before deciding. His name is Huinan, and he is about to become the target of something he did not invite. The first vendor snaps at him for taking too long. Her words are sharp, her tone dismissive. Huinan looks up at her, thanks her genuinely, makes his purchase, and moves on. His face has not changed. The second vendor is louder. He makes a performance of his irritation, drawing the attention of nearby stalls. Who do you monks think you are? Examining everything like you are buying for the emperor. If you cannot afford good rice, buy the cheap kind and stop wasting my time. Several people turn to look. Some are visibly uncomfortable. No one intervenes. Huinan finishes his examination, pays the exact amount, places the rice carefully in his bag, and continues through the market. Unhurried, unchanged. Then a wealthy merchant named Sangwai, who has been watching this unfold with growing contempt, strides forward. He is a man used to deference, accustomed to his opinions, shaping the air in a room. He plants himself in front of Huinan and delivers his verdict loudly enough for the surrounding stalls to hear. You are arrogant. You shave your head and wear those clothes and think it makes you better than the rest of us. You are nothing but a beggar pretending to be holy. The market goes quiet. Everyone is waiting for the monk to break. Some want him to defend himself. Some are simply curious what a person does when struck this directly in public. Sangwai is waiting too, for the flinch, the reddening face, the stumbling attempt at dignity that would confirm his superiority. Huinan finishes placing the last of his purchases in his bag. Then he straightens, turns to face Sangwai, and meets his eyes with an expression that contains no anger and no performance of calm, just clarity. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, he says. I hope the rest of your day brings you genuine happiness. Sangwai stares at him. He has launched everything he had, and it landed nowhere. That is all you have to say? His voice carries frustration now, something close to bewilderment. You are not angry? You are not going to defend yourself? Huinan tilts his head slightly, genuinely curious, not theatrical. What would I defend myself against? You have offered me something. I have chosen not to take it. Tell me, if you bring a gift to someone and they do not accept it, who does the gift belong to? Sangwai answers without thinking, to the person who brought it. Yes, says Huinan quietly. Your anger and your judgment are yours. I did not take them from you. They remain exactly where they came from. He bows slightly, picks up his bag, and walks back through the market at the same pace he arrived. Sangwai stands alone in the silence he created, holding something he suddenly cannot put down. This exchange is not a story about a particularly disciplined monk. It is an illustration of a specific teaching the Buddha gave, recorded in the connected discourses of the Pali Canon, in response to a Brahmin who came to him with hostility and insults. The Buddha listened to everything the man said without interruption. Then he asked, "When you prepare a feast for guests, and the guests do not eat, who does the food belong to?" The Brahmin answered, "To the host, I suppose." The Buddha said, "In the same way, I do not accept what you have brought. It remains with you." What makes this teaching remarkable is its precision. It is not asking you to pretend that hostility does not sting. It is not suggesting you achieve some elevated state where words slide off you like water. It is pointing at something structural, something about how psychological harm actually works. Harm of this kind requires two participants: the person who offers it and the person who accepts it. Remove the second participant and the transaction cannot complete. The anger exists, the judgment exists, but it remains with the person carrying it. It does not transfer unless you reach out and take it. Most of us have been reaching out and taking things our whole lives without realizing we had a choice. Someone speaks harshly to you at the end of a long day, and you carry that harshness home. It sits with you through dinner. It follows you into the evening. You replay the moment in bed, adjusting it, responding differently in your mind, feeling the sting of it again with each pass. By midnight, you have carried it for 8 hours. The person who offered it has almost certainly forgotten it. This is precisely what the Buddha identified as the fourth of the 5 mental states that most reliably prevent sleep. Not the original upset. That is understandable and human. The restlessness that follows from continuing to hold it long after the moment has ended. The mind that cannot settle because it is still replaying something that is already over. Still trying to resolve in thought what cannot be resolved in thought. Still gripping something that was never required to be gripped. The teaching does not ask you to feel differently about what happened. It asks a simpler question: is this yours to carry? If someone handed you a coat that did not belong to you and walked away, you would not take it home. You would set it down, not out of indifference, because it was never yours. The anger someone directed at you today, the judgment delivered with confidence by someone who does not know your life, these were offered in your direction, but they were never actually about you. They were about the person carrying them. They belong to whatever is unresolved in that person's own interior. You were simply the nearest available surface. Sangwai walked home that evening, still holding what he brought to the market. Juinan walked home, carrying only rice and vegetables. Tonight, before sleep comes, it is worth asking what you are still carrying from the day. not to analyze it or argue with it, just to notice whether it was ever actually yours, whether you picked it up because it required holding, or simply because it was handed to you and you did not think to set it down. You can set it down now, not by resolving it, by recognizing it was never yours to resolve. Juinan walked out of that market, carrying only what he arrived with. But there is a harder situation than the anger of a stranger, and that is the criticism of someone who knows your name, who points at you specifically, who delivers a judgment about who you are, with the confidence of someone who believes they are right. A young monk once heard exactly that, at a well, from people who did not know. He could hear them. What he did with it next is the teaching. He is lazy, sleeps past the other monks, I hear. Young people today, no real dedication, no context yet, no location, no names, no surrounding detail, just these words floating in cool mountain air, near a stone well, spoken by two women washing vegetables for their families. Words that were precise and certain and completely wrong, delivered with the full confidence of people who had never once met the person they were describing. A young monk named Joshua heard every syllable. He was walking his morning rounds through the village, carrying a wooden bowl for the monastery's daily alms collection, when their voices reached him across the quiet street. He did not announce himself. He did not correct them. He kept walking, head down, and listened to the rest. What they said was not simply unkind. It was a fully constructed portrait of a person who did not exist. The lazy monk who had joined the monastery to avoid real work. The young man without true spiritual commitment. The pretender in robes. Every detail was wrong. Joshua rose before dawn each day, earlier than anyone else in the community. He sat longer, worked harder in the gardens, studied later into the night. He had given up a comfortable life with his family to pursue this path with complete sincerity. Not one word of what those women said had any contact with reality. And yet by the time he completed his rounds and returned to the monastery, he was ruined for the morning. Not by what they said, by what he did with it afterward. Because Joshua did something that most people do so automatically, they do not notice it happening. He picked up their arrows and turned them on himself. He took their false portrait and held it up against his own reflection and began, without realizing it, to examine whether it fit. He revisited his own behavior, looking for evidence. He constructed elaborate defenses in his mind that he delivered to an audience who were not present. He felt his face flush with anger, and then shame, and then a helpless indignation that had nowhere to go. By the time he reached his teacher's garden, he had been stabbing himself with those women's words for 2 hours. The teacher Yunmen was trimming a small pine tree when Joshua arrived. He looked up once, read the young monk's face without comment, and gestured for him to sit. Joshua told the story, all of it, The specific words, the confident tone of the speakers, the complete falseness of everything they said, the anger he could not release, the shame he could not justify, the strange helplessness of being accurately described as someone he had never been. His voice tightened as he spoke. The morning's wound was still fully open. Yunmen listened until the silence after the last word settled. Then he set down his small trimming tool and asked a question that seemed to come from a different conversation entirely. When you practice archery and your arrow misses the target, what do you do? Joshua blinked. I check my aim and try again. And if another archer shoots at the same target and also misses, does their miss affect your next shot? No, their arrow has nothing to do with mine. Yunmen nodded once. Those women drew a target in the air and shot their arrows at it. Their target was a person they invented, a lazy monk, a young man without commitment. This person does not exist. Their arrows flew through empty air and fell to the ground. They never reached you. He paused and looked directly at Joshua. But you were watching, and you caught those arrows mid-flight. You picked them up and loaded them into your own bow, and you have been shooting yourself with them all morning. The women caused you no harm. You have been doing that entirely yourself. Joshua sat with this for a long moment. Something in his chest that had been clenched began, very slowly, to release its grip. The Buddha taught this directly in a discourse that has remained in the Pali canon unchanged for 25 centuries. He described two arrows. The first arrives from outside, an unpleasant experience, a painful sensation, a harsh word from someone in a market or beside a well. This arrow lands. It hurts. This is not optional. The first arrow is simply part of being a person moving through a world that contains other people with their own unresolved interior storms. The second arrow is different. The second arrow is what an untrained mind fires at itself in response to the first. The hours of replaying the conversation, the internal argument with someone who is not present, the search through your own history for evidence that perhaps they were right, the shame that follows the anger, the exhaustion that follows the shame. The first arrow caused pain. The second arrow causes suffering. And the second arrow is always, in every case, self-inflicted. This is not a teaching about emotional suppression. The Buddha was precise about this. He did not say the first arrow does not hurt. He said a trained mind feels the first arrow and does not add the second. The pain is acknowledged. The experience is real. And then the mind does not compound it, does not build a structure of suffering on top of a moment that has already passed. Most of the weight people carry into their nights is not the first arrow. The first arrow lands, and its moment is over quickly. What fills the hours between dinner and sleep, what turns in the mind while the body is trying to rest, is almost entirely second arrows. Constructed suffering, suffering happening right now, in this present moment, about something that ended hours or days or years ago. Here is what is worth sitting with tonight. Not what happened today that hurt you, but how many times you have reshot that arrow at yourself since the moment it first arrived. You do not have to answer this by resolving anything. You do not have to arrive at forgiveness or understanding or any particular feeling. The teaching simply asks you to notice the distinction. The first arrow was real and it landed. Everything since then has been you, picking it up, loading it, and firing it again. One arrow is enough. You do not have to carry the second one into sleep. Yun Men returned to his small pine tree after Joshua left. He trimmed one more branch and then stood quietly, looking at what remained. A tree shaped not by force, but by the steady, patient removal of what did not belong. Which is exactly what the next teaching is about. Not the dramatic wounds from other people's arrows, but the quieter ones, the ones that arrive so small and so slowly that most people do not notice them taking root until they have already grown into something that fills the whole garden. Before the sky lightens, before the birds find their first notes, before any other monk in the temple has stirred from sleep, there is a small flame moving through a garden, row by row, unhurried, the oil lamp held low, its circle of light falling soft and warm on the dark soil beneath it. Only after watching this flame for some time do you notice the hands holding it, then the robe, then the man, Brother Huiming, who has tended this garden for 20 years and walks it every single morning in the last darkness before dawn, looking at the ground with the focused attention of someone reading something important. This is not ordinary gardening. He is not pulling weeds. He is looking for what is about to become a weed, the tiny green thread barely visible in the lamplight, the almost invisible shoot that arrived yesterday on the wind and has been in the soil for perhaps 18 hours. At this stage, it can be removed with a single touch, a light scrape of a pointed stick, and it is gone without trace, without disturbing anything growing around it. Tomorrow, it would require more effort. In a week, it would be a problem. In a month, it would have threaded its roots through the roots of everything nearby, and removing it would mean damaging what you were trying to protect. This is why Huiming walks the rows before dawn. Not because the garden is in crisis, because he has learned that the difference between a manageable garden and an overwhelming one is measured in hours, not seasons. A young monk named Faxian had been assigned to help with the garden work. He arrived from the city, curious and willing, but without any experience of growing things, and he watched Huiming's pre-dawn routine with polite bewilderment. After several mornings of this, he finally asked the question that had been sitting with him. Why walk the rows every single day? Would it not be more efficient to do a thorough weeding once each week and be finished with it? Huiming crouched beside a row of young lettuce and gestured for Faxian to look closely at the soil between the plants. Faxian leaned in and saw nothing, just dark earth. Huiming took his pointed stick and scraped the surface very gently. There, barely visible, were 3 pale green threads, no larger than a thumbnail. These arrived 2 days ago, Huiming said. By your weekly schedule, they would be 5 times this size before you touch them. By the end of the month, they would own this row. Faxian looked at the tiny shoots and then at his teacher. The mind, said Huiming, replacing the stick in his robe pocket, works exactly like this garden. Every day, from every direction, from conversations you half heard, from things that did not go as you hoped, from fears about tomorrow that have not happened yet, seeds arrive. Most of them are harmless and will not take root, but some will, and the ones that do grow, according to the same law as every living thing, small and easy to address at the beginning, enormous and tangled if left alone. The Buddha taught this with the precision of someone who had spent years observing exactly how the mind generates its own suffering. He identified 5 specific methods for removing an unwanted thought, not as a ranked list to work through in order, but as 5 different tools for 5 different situations, the way a gardener carries different instruments for different tasks. The first is simply to redirect attention. When an unhelpful thought arrives, bring the mind to something wholesome instead, the breath, a quality of genuine care, the simple fact of being alive in this moment. This works when the thought is new and has not yet gathered momentum. Huiming does this every morning when he moves from one garden row to the next, leaving behind what he has already checked and giving his full attention to what is in front of him now. The second is to examine the thought's consequences clearly. A thought that seems to offer something, the satisfaction of resentment, the relief of worry that feels like preparation, becomes less appealing when you look honestly at where it leads. Replaying an argument does not resolve the argument. Rehearsing tomorrow's difficulties does not prevent them. Seeing this clearly often dissolves the thought's grip without any further effort. The third is deliberate non-attention, not suppression, not fighting, simply choosing not to engage. A thought that receives no water, no attention, no further thinking does not grow. It sits in the soil and eventually dries out. Huiming demonstrated this for Faxian one afternoon by pointing to a small weed he had deliberately left untouched for 4 days in a dry corner of the garden. It had not spread. It had simply sat there, its energy spent, going nowhere. The fourth is to slow the thought-forming process itself, to feel the moment when one anxious thought is about to generate another, to catch that movement before it completes, the way you might notice your hand reaching for something and choose to pause before taking it. This requires a quality of attention that develops with practice, but once it is present, it is extraordinarily effective. Most mental suffering is not one difficult thought, but a chain of them, each pulling the next into existence. Breaking the chain at the second or third link prevents everything that would have followed. The fifth, for the thought that persists through all of this, is a deliberate and temporary act of mental stillness, a brief, conscious stopping of the mental movement, the way you might clench a fist to stop a hand from trembling. The Buddha described this as a last resort, not a first response. Used occasionally, it works. Used as a habit, it exhausts the mind, which is why the first 4 methods matter. Later that afternoon, while working silently near the garden gate, Faxian heard 2 visiting monks speaking critically about the head teacher. Their words were not kind. Immediately, something in Faxian's mind began to form a response, a small shoot of agreement, of doubt about the teacher he had respected, of comparison between this monastery and others. He noticed it. He noticed it while it was still small enough to remove with a single touch. He did not argue with it or judge himself for having it. He simply chose not to water it with further thought and returned his attention to the physical work of his hands. The shoot sat in the soil for a moment and then, without nourishment, went nowhere. That evening, Huaiming watched his student work and said nothing. He could see that something had shifted. A person who has learned to catch a thought while it is small carries themselves differently, less burdened, more present, as though the weight of every unconsidered thing they used to carry has been quietly set down. For over 2,000 years in Theravada communities across Southeast Asia, practitioners have gathered before sleep to recite protective chants specifically designed to do for the community what Huaiming did alone each morning, to clear the mental ground before rest, to prevent the seeds of disturbance from taking hold in the night. The form is different. The understanding is identical. What you allow to settle in the mind before sleep is what the mind will grow while you are not watching. Tonight, whatever arrived uninvited in the last 24 hours, the stray criticism, the worry about something unresolved, the small doubt that attached itself to an ordinary moment, can be seen for what it is. A seed, still small, still easy. You do not have to uproot it with force. You simply do not have to water it tonight. Huaiming walks his rows to find what is growing before it takes hold. But this raises a question he never addressed with Faxian, not about what grows in the garden, but about who is walking the rows. Something in you has been watching every thought arrive and depart for your entire life. You have never once had to remind it to pay attention. What is that watching? And what happens when you turn toward it instead of toward what it is watching? What do you see when you look up at that sky? The question arrives before anything else. Before a location, before a face, before any sense of who is asking or why. Just the question, and above it, whatever sky your mind builds when it hears the word. A monk named Norbu is being asked this by his teacher on a high stone terrace in the Tibetan mountains, where the air is so clear it seems to sharpen everything it touches. Norbu looks up. The sky is deep blue, the particular blue that exists only at altitude, and across it move large white clouds, slowly, without hurry, indifferent to any direction. I see clouds, Norbu says, many clouds against a blue sky. His teacher, an old man named Tenzin, whose white beard moves in the mountain wind, nods once. And the clouds that were here yesterday, at this same hour, are any of them still there? No, they have all moved on. Yes, each one forms, drifts across, and dissolves back into open space. None of them stay. He pauses. Now tell me about the sky itself. Does the sky change? Norbu looks again, this time past the clouds, to the vast blue expanse that holds them. The sky stays the same, always present, always open. The clouds move through it, but the sky itself does not move. Tenzin turns to look at his student directly. When you sit in meditation, what do you notice in your mind? Norbu has been a monk for 2 years and has struggled with the same visitors every single day. Memories of his life before the monastery, the prosperity he once had, the betrayal that ended it, the grief that followed him up the mountain, and alongside the memories, a restlessness that makes genuine stillness feel permanently out of reach. I see many thoughts, he says, memories, anger, worry about whether I made the right choice coming here. Sometimes it feels as though the thoughts fill the entire mind. There is no space left that is not occupied by something painful. Tenzin is quiet for a moment, watching the clouds. Are these the same thoughts you had yesterday? The themes are similar, but the specific thoughts change. Different memories, different versions of the worry. Like clouds, says Tenzin simply. Then, after a long pause, in which only the wind speaks, what is it that notices the thoughts? What is aware of the memories and the worry while they are passing through? This question stops Norbu completely. In 2 years of practice, he has never once turned his attention in this direction. He has always been focused on the thoughts themselves, managing them, escaping them, enduring them. He has never paused to notice the awareness that was watching all of it. He tries now. He turns his attention away from the thoughts and toward whatever is doing the noticing. It is like turning to look at your own eyes rather than at what your eyes are seeing. Strange at first, and then suddenly, very still. The awareness seems always present, Norbu says. Finally, his voice quieter than before. It does not seem disturbed by the thoughts that pass through it, even the painful ones. Yes, there is something in Tenzin's voice that is not just agreement, something closer to relief, the relief of a teacher watching a student finally see what was always there. Your thoughts are clouds. They form, move, dissolve. Some are dark and heavy. Some are light. All of them pass. But you are not the clouds. You are the sky that holds them. And the sky has never once been damaged by the weather moving through it. This teaching does not ask you to believe anything. It asks you to look. Right now, thoughts are arriving. You did not schedule them. Some are about today. Some are about things nowhere near today. But something in you is registering all of it. The arriving, the content, the departing. That something is not itself a thought. It was present before the last thought arrived, and it will be present after the next one leaves. It has been present through every experience of your entire life, and not one of those experiences has changed what it fundamentally is. The Buddha approached this same recognition when he invited his monks to examine every element of human experience: the body, sensation, perception, thought, and consciousness itself, and honestly ask of each one, is this me? Is this what I am? And in each case, the answer was the same. These are things you have, things that arise and pass within experience. They are not the one who is experiencing. A thought arises, it passes, and it is not you, any more than a cloud passing overhead is the sky. The ancient Buddhist philosophical tradition that examined the mind in precise detail described a state called the life continuum, the baseline resting condition of consciousness that underlies every experience, including dreamless sleep. In deep, dreamless sleep, the mind returns to this ground, not to blankness, to its own natural resting state, clear, stable, undisturbed. You visit this ground every night without knowing it. Every morning you return from it. The Tibetan teachers called this same ground the clear light, not dramatic or blinding, but the quiet, steady luminosity of a mind that has stopped being disturbed by its own contents. What both traditions point at is not a spiritual achievement reserved for advanced practitioners. It is the natural baseline of consciousness that has been present your entire life, underneath every anxious thought, every difficult memory, every sleepless hour. Training the mind in stillness is not building something new. It is learning to recognize what the mind already rests in every single night. When a thought arrives as you are trying to sleep tonight, and thoughts will arrive, this is simply what minds do. You do not have to engage with it. You do not have to follow it or fight it. You can simply notice that you are aware of it. Rest in the noticing rather than in the thought. The sky receiving the cloud, not becoming it. Norbu sat on that stone terrace for a long time after Tenzin left. The clouds kept moving. The sky kept holding them. For the first time since arriving at the monastery, he felt something other than the weight of what he was carrying. He felt the space in which the weight was being carried. Vast, quiet, entirely untroubled by anything that had passed through it. The sky does not shrink from clouds, even the ones that carry storms. The question the next teaching asks is what to do when those clouds are not thoughts at all, when they arrive not as ideas, but as something felt in the chest, the throat, the stomach, with a weight that thoughts alone do not carry. When the cloud has a name, and its name is fear. Notice the chest first. That tightening somewhere just below the collarbone, the one that arrives before any thought has formed to explain it. Then the breath, slightly shallower than it was a moment ago, slightly faster, not quite reaching the bottom of the lungs. Then the scanning, the mind moving quickly through recent memory. checking exits, running its quiet audit of everything that could go wrong, building a case for danger, even when nothing specific can be named. This is fear, not the dramatic kind that announces itself with obvious cause. The quiet kind, the kind that lives in the body before it reaches the mind, that tightens the jaw during ordinary conversations, wakes a person at 3 a.m. with a general unease that cannot be traced to its source, and sits somewhere just behind the ordinary hours of the day, like a sound that never quite resolves. A young monk named Pema knew this feeling with great precision. He had come to a remote monastery carved into a cliff face in the Tibetan mountains specifically to deepen his practice. He was sincere in his commitment and worked harder than most. In group sessions, morning chanting, communal meditation, the shared work of maintaining the buildings and gardens, he felt grounded and capable. His mind settled well in the presence of others. But when he attempted to practice alone, particularly in silence, particularly after dark, something arrived that he could neither name nor manage. A formless dread that filled every corner of whatever room he occupied. A sense of something waiting in the quiet that he had been successfully moving around for years, long before the mountains, and that the silence of this place was now making impossible to avoid. The monastery had a practice every monk was expected to complete once each month, a full night of solitary retreat in a small cave set deeper in the cliff. Complete darkness, complete silence, no contact with the community until morning. For 3 months, Pema found reasons to avoid his turn. Kitchen duties that could not wait, a developing illness that required proximity to the infirmary, offering to take the place of monks whose schedules were overloaded. The careful, quiet evasions of someone who cannot yet admit, even to himself, what he is actually afraid of. His teacher, the Lama Tupten, observed all of this without comment for some time. He had guided many students through many different shapes of avoidance over the decades, and he had learned that confronting it head-on rarely helped. People tended to argue back or to feel ashamed in ways that added another layer of difficulty on top of the original one. What helped was something quieter, removing the belief that the avoided thing was as dangerous as the avoiding mind insisted it was. One morning he called Pema to his room, poured tea with the unhurried movements of a man who has nowhere more important to be, and asked one question. When you imagine being alone in the cave, what do you believe you will find there? Pema sat with this honestly. I do not think I will find anything specific, he said slowly. It is more that I am afraid of what I might find in myself. Something I have been moving around for a long time. Something about who I am when there is no one else in the room and nothing left to distract me from it. Tupten nodded as though this were the most reasonable thing he had heard all week. Good, he said. Then tonight you will go to the cave, but you will not go alone. Pema felt relief move through him before he understood what was being said. You will go with your fear, said Tupten. Instead of trying to leave it at the entrance, you will invite it inside. You will greet it the way you would greet a visitor who has traveled a great distance to find you, with acknowledgement, with genuine gratitude, and with the simple offer of a place to sit. And then you will remain there together for the night. Pema looked at his teacher without speaking. Fear arrives because it believes it is protecting you, Tupton continued. It learned this role a long time ago, in circumstances where the protection was genuinely needed, where staying alert and ready meant staying safe. It has carried out this work faithfully ever since, long past the moment when the original danger passed and the original circumstances changed beyond recognition. It does not need to be overcome. It needs to be told clearly, gently, and with real gratitude for what it has tried to do, that you see it, that you are not unaware of its efforts, and that tonight you are safe. That night, Pema lit his small lamp, settled onto his cushion, and the darkness pressed in from every direction immediately. The stone walls of the cave held a cold that had not changed for centuries. Within minutes, the familiar response arrived. The tightening in the chest, the shallowing of the breath, the mind moving quickly to find the door. And instead of fighting it, he spoke to it quietly. "I know you are here," he said, barely above a whisper. "I am not asking you to leave. I am asking you to sit with me." Something shifted. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to notice. The fear did not disappear. Its quality changed, from a wall that blocked passage to something more like a presence that could simply be shared. As the hours deepened, Pema began to sense what lay underneath the fear, not by pushing through it, but because the fear, having been acknowledged without argument, gradually loosened its grip enough for him to feel what it had been covering. A deep loneliness, an old ache of feeling somehow separate from everyone, from everything, from whatever ground he had once stood on before his life changed. He allowed himself to feel this fully, without any attempt to resolve it. And in the center of that loneliness, something unexpected. A warmth, a quiet, steady presence that had been there the entire time, undiminished by the fear or the darkness or the years of careful avoidance, not arriving from somewhere outside, simply what had always been underneath, patient, waiting, without impatience for him to become still enough to notice it. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has a formal practice built on this precise discovery. It is called sleep yoga, one of the most carefully developed Buddhist teachings on what actually happens as consciousness passes into rest. Its practitioners train the mind to recognize, at the exact threshold between waking and sleep, the same quiet ground that Pema touched in that cave. Not to construct or achieve a particular state, to recognize what is already present when the noise and movement have finally stopped. The practice exists because this ground, this quiet, undisturbed baseline of consciousness, is always there. It requires not effort, but recognition. And recognition is only possible for a mind that has learned, at least in small ways, to stop running. The Buddha named what lies behind this running precisely. He called it aversion, the reflexive, pulling away from difficult experience, the instinct to create distance between ourselves and whatever is uncomfortable or frightening. He taught that this pulling away is the primary source of suffering that we ourselves create, and that its resolution begins not with achieving better circumstances, not with waiting for the right conditions, but with simply stopping the pulling away, sitting with what is here, letting it be known. The difficult thing does not disappear when we stop running from it, but it becomes, almost immediately, smaller than it was when we were moving. Tonight, if something uncomfortable arrives as you settle towards sleep, a worry, a grief, a restlessness without a clear name, you do not have to make it go away. You do not have to understand it or trace it to its source tonight. You can simply acknowledge it. It has been asking for your attention for some time. Give it a moment of genuine, unjudging attention and notice what happens in its grip. Pema left the cave at dawn, having slept more deeply than he had in months. The fear did not vanish in a single night, but something between them had changed permanently. He had found that the thing he was most afraid of meeting in the silence was not a threat waiting to harm him. It was a door that had been standing open the entire time. What Pema found behind his fear was a tenderness he had not expected, a compassion not yet fully extended toward himself. The next teaching follows that tenderness directly to its source. A young woman who kept refusing the Buddha's presence for a reason that felt like wisdom, and discovered, in the moment she finally stopped refusing, that her reason itself had become the path. She kept finding reasons not to go. The other nuns walked the familiar garden path each morning without hesitation, settling into the teaching hall with the ease of people who have found what they came looking for. They emerged an hour later, visibly lighter, something in their eyes clearer, something in their shoulders less held. Day after day this happened, and day after day, a young nun named Nanda found somewhere else to be. A task that needed finishing, a duty that could not wait, the quiet, practiced evasions of someone who has become very skilled at not quite arriving at the thing she is avoiding. She was not neglecting her practice. She maintained every other obligation with genuine care: communal work, individual meditation, the daily rhythms of monastic life, carried out without complaint. What she avoided, with quiet consistency and considerable ingenuity, was any circumstance that would place her in direct sight of the Buddha himself. The reason, when it finally surfaces, is not what you would expect. Nanda was known throughout the community for her beauty, not in the way that creates admiration at a distance, in the immediate, difficult way that makes a person an object before she has opened her mouth, that generates attention she never asked for and cannot put down, that follows her into spaces where she came to be something entirely other than seen. She had entered monastic life in part to step out of that story, to become, finally, someone whose worth had nothing to do with how she appeared to others. To be known, if she was known at all, for what she understood rather than what she looked like. But the pride she carried about her beauty and the shame she carried about that pride had become tangled into something she could not cleanly separate. She was afraid that seeing the Buddha, whose presence was by all accounts extraordinary, would stir in her a quality of vanity she believed she was supposed to have already released, that her response would reveal to herself more than anyone how much of that old attachment remained. So she stayed away, managed the risk by never entering the room where it existed, told herself this was caution, and let the telling go unexamined. The Buddha noticed. He did not address it directly, did not send a teaching on the subject of avoidance or a gentle correction about what she was doing. He simply asked someone to let Nanda know he would like to speak with her. Nothing more, no additional framing, nothing that would give her a clear reason to refuse without it becoming obvious what she was doing. She came, with the careful composure of someone who has decided in advance not to look directly at the thing they have come to meet. What arrived was not a lecture. The Buddha created a vision, a woman of extraordinary beauty, vivid and present in the room, as clearly as any physical form. Nanda saw her without effort, without being asked to look. She was simply there. And then the woman began to age. Not gradually, not gently, with the unmistakable movement of time that spares nothing and negotiates with no one. The brightness of youth shifted, loosened, changed in texture, the way all living things change. Middle age arrived with its particular weight and its particular dignities. Then old age, the deep lines, the posture that carries decades in its curve, the way the body becomes a visible record of everything it has lived through. Then illness, then death, the full arc of a form moving through its entire life, from first radiance to final dissolution, compressed into a single uninterrupted seeing. Nanda watched all of it without looking away. Not because she was transfixed by horror, because something in what she was seeing was landing in her with the precision of something she had always known and never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. This is what beauty does. Not as punishment, not as proof of anything failing, as the simple, neutral movement of impermanence through every form that exists. Every form, without exception, including her own. And what she felt as she watched was not grief. It was something closer to recognition, the particular relief of discovering that what you have been carrying as a private shame turns out to be a universal condition. She was not uniquely burdened by her beauty, not uniquely far from liberation for having struggled with what it stirred in her. She was simply a person, in a body, watching what all bodies do, feeling what any honest person would feel upon seeing it clearly. What released in that moment was not only vanity, the shame released too, because both had been built on the same misunderstanding, that her appearance was something she was, rather than something she temporarily had. The pride said, "This is mine. and it makes me more. The shame said, this attention makes me less than what I am trying to become. Both were arguments about something already in the process of passing, never as fixed or defining as either argument required it to be. When she saw this clearly, both arguments lost their footing at the same moment. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught impermanence, not as a teaching about loss, but as a teaching that dissolves what we build around impermanent things that causes us suffering. Vanity is suffering. The shame of vanity is also suffering. Clear seeing ends both, simultaneously, through the same single act of looking, without flinching. The self-compassion that came to Nanda in that room was not soft or consoling in the ordinary sense. It arrived through precision, not comfort, not reassurance that she was fine as she was, that her fears were unfounded, but a clarity so complete that the structure of self-criticism simply lost its foundation. You cannot maintain a harsh judgment about something you have seen all the way through. The judgment requires a certain kind of not knowing in order to survive. Most of us carry some version of Nanda's avoidance, not necessarily about appearance, about something we have decided, without fully examining, that we are not ready to look at directly. A quality in ourselves we find difficult to accept, a pattern we can feel but have not yet traced to its source, a corner of our own experience we keep just outside honest attention, circling it without entering it, year after year, quietly hoping it will soften on its own if given enough time. It does not soften, it waits, with remarkable patience. The teaching does not ask you to force anything open tonight. It simply observes that what we avoid does not diminish in the avoiding, and that when we finally look clearly, not harshly, not with the aggressive scrutiny of self-judgment, but with the same quiet steadiness, Nanda eventually brought to the vision in front of her, we often find something smaller and more ordinary than we feared. A part of our own experience that simply needed to be seen, without the additional weight of shame about having it. Nanda stopped running from her own reflection and found that the room she had avoided for weeks was exactly where everything she was carrying finally put itself down. The next teaching moves from the interior to the exterior, from the parts of ourselves we keep avoiding to the person standing directly in front of us who seems to exist entirely to disrupt our peace. What if that person did not arrive by accident? What if they appeared at precisely this moment in your life because your practice needed exactly what only they could offer? The sounds arrive before the eyes can find anything to fix on. Something moving in the canopy above, slow, deliberate, heavier than a bird. Then stillness. Then another sound from a different direction, lower, closer to the ground. Stopping the moment, attention turns toward it. The darkness between the trees is not empty. It has texture and movement and a quality of presence that the rational mind cannot quite account for and cannot quite dismiss. A group of monks had been sent by the Buddha to spend the rains retreat in a forest in the Kosala region. They arrived with good intentions and settled into their practice with care. But the forest had other inhabitants, spirits of the trees, in the understanding of that time and place, beings that were neither welcoming nor indifferent to the monks who had moved into their home without asking. Strange sounds in the night, presences felt at the edge of sleep, visions that arrived at the threshold between waking and dreaming and left the monks shaken and unable to settle. After weeks of this, the monks returned to the Buddha. They could not practice in that forest. The fear was too consistent, too physical, too present in the body to allow the stillness that genuine meditation requires. They needed either permission to leave or something that would make staying possible. The Buddha gave them something to take back with them, not a technique for suppressing fear, not an argument for why the spirits were not real or the fear was unfounded. A practice that would change the quality of mind the monks brought into the forest each night, so thoroughly, so genuinely, that the forest itself would respond differently to them. He gave them what has been recited in Theravada communities every night for over 2,500 years, the teaching on loving kindness. He began with a list of qualities: capable, upright, straightforward, gentle in speech, without conceit, content, easy to support, with few duties, living lightly. These were not moral requirements, but practical preparations, the description of a mind that has cleared enough interior space to do what comes next. A mind still cluttered with ambition, resentment, and self-importance cannot hold goodwill steadily. It keeps bumping into its own furniture. Then the practice itself, extending goodwill, genuine, unconditional, unlimited goodwill in every direction, to all living beings, without exception, weak or strong, long or large, or medium, short, small, or fat, seen or unseen, near or far, born or yet to be born, every being, everywhere, without a single exception carved out. The Pali phrase at the heart of this teaching is Sukhiyatana Parihareya. May one sustain oneself in happiness. The Buddha did not begin the practice of loving kindness by directing goodwill outward. He began it here, with the self, with the instruction that the practitioner must first genuinely wish their own well-being before the outward movement can be real. This is not selfishness. It is the recognition that goodwill extended from a place of self-contempt or self-neglect is not goodwill. It is performance. The foundation must be solid before anything can rest on it. For many people, this first direction is the hardest. Extending warmth outward, toward loved ones, toward strangers, even toward difficult people in the abstract, is one kind of challenge. Turning that same warmth directly toward yourself, without irony, without the immediate qualification of all the ways you have fallen short, without the reflexive internal voice that says, "You have not yet earned that quality of regard." This is another kind of challenge entirely, a more honest one, and the teaching asks you to meet it first, before moving anywhere else. The monks returned to the forest with this practice. What changed was not the forest. What changed was the quality of mind they brought into it each night. A mind genuinely filled with goodwill toward all beings has no enemy to protect itself against. It does not need to scan the darkness for threats, because it has already extended its care to whatever lives in the darkness. The vigilance that keeps a person awake, the mental rehearsing, the bracing against what might arrive, the body's refusal to fully unguard itself, all of this runs on the assumption that there is something out there that wishes you harm, and that staying alert is the appropriate response. Loving kindness practice dissolves that assumption, not by arguing against it, but by replacing its root. The mind that has genuinely sent goodwill in all directions has nothing left to defend against. The body receives this information and responds accordingly. The Buddha said it plainly in the same teaching. The practitioner of loving kindness sleeps in comfort, wakes in comfort, dreams no evil dreams. This is the only place in the entire Pali Canon where the Buddha names restful sleep as a direct and specific fruit of a practice. He is not speaking poetically. He is describing a mechanism, the precise way that a mind trained in goodwill relates to the hours of vulnerability that sleep requires. Consider what the vigilant mind does at night. It reviews the day for everything that went wrong and everything that might. It rehearses conversations that have not happened yet, and replays ones that have, adjusting, defending, preparing for a trial that is not scheduled. It holds the body in a state of readiness that the body was not designed to maintain through the sleeping hours. The jaw tightens. The shoulders stay lifted. Sleep arrives late and leaves early, and the morning carries the weight of a night spent on guard. This is not a flaw. It is the mind doing what it believes is required of it. The loving kindness practice does not argue with the mind's logic. It changes the information the mind is working with. When genuine goodwill has been extended in all directions, including foundationally toward yourself, the mind's assessment shifts. There is nothing out there that has not already received your care. The guard can be stood down. The body, receiving this permission at last, does what it was always capable of doing. It rests. Tonight, before sleep arrives, try the direction the Buddha named first. Not outward yet, inward. Simply the genuine wish that you yourself be well, that you be free from unnecessary suffering, that you sleep tonight in the comfort that this teaching promises, not as a formula repeated without feeling, but as something you actually mean, even if meaning it requires a moment of effort, even if meaning it feels unfamiliar. Then, if it feels natural, let that goodwill move outward to the people in the nearest rooms, to the people in the surrounding streets, to everyone in this city tonight who is also trying to sleep, also carrying the weight of a day that asked things of them, to everyone struggling anywhere in the world in this same hour, in ways you will never know about and do not need to know about for the goodwill to be real. To all of it, without exception, without needing to manage the details. The forest monks slept that night. The sounds in the canopy did not stop. The darkness between the trees did not become less dark. What changed was the relationship between the monks and the darkness, no longer adversarial, no longer requiring defense, held inside a quality of mind that had room for all of it and needed to fight none of it. The monks who learned this practice did not just sleep better. They began to encounter the world differently when they were awake. The quality of mind that allows restful sleep is identical to the quality of mind that makes waking life manageable, which is why the Buddha identified with such precision the 5 things that most reliably destroy it. We call them hindrances. The 4th one is the one that keeps most people awake. Imagine a bowl of clear water, still, clean, completely transparent. You can see straight through to the bottom, every grain of sand, every small stone resting on the floor of it, perfectly visible. This is the mind at its natural resting best, not achieved through effort, not earned through long practice. Simply what clarity looks like when nothing is disturbing it. The Buddha used exactly this image, a bowl of water, to describe 5 specific conditions that prevent a person from seeing clearly, from settling deeply, from resting fully. He was speaking to a king who had asked him to describe the fruits of a contemplative life, and what he offered was not abstract philosophy, but 5 precise images that a person could recognize immediately in their own experience. Images so accurate that 25 centuries have not made them less so. The first disturbance. Someone adds dye to the water. Rich color, deep red, or gold, or blue, spreading through the bowl until the water holds nothing but color. You cannot see the bottom anymore. The clarity is gone, replaced by something vivid and absorbing that draws the eye entirely to itself. This is the mind caught in desire, not just physical desire, but the wanting mind in any of its forms. The mind that needs this particular outcome, this specific future, this exact version of how things should turn out. The water is not damaged. It simply cannot see through itself while the color fills it. The second disturbance. The bowl is brought to boiling. The surface churns and breaks. Steam rises. The water that was clear a moment ago is now agitated by heat that distorts everything it passes through. You cannot see the bottom through boiling water, not because there is nothing there, but because the movement itself blocks the seeing. This is ill will, the mind heated by resentment, irritation, or anger toward another person or toward circumstances. It does not have to be dramatic or conscious. A low, persistent simmer is enough. The heat is enough. The distortion is the same. The third disturbance is quieter than the others. Algae grows across the surface of the water, green and thick, spreading slowly from the edges inward until it covers everything. The water beneath is still there, still potentially clear, but the surface has become opaque, sealed off, no longer available for reflection. This is the heavy, dull quality of a mind that has stopped engaging, not because it is at rest, but because it has lost its aliveness. The exhaustion that feels like peace but is actually stagnation. The torpor that makes everything feel slightly too far away to matter. The fifth disturbance, and we will come back to the fourth, which requires longer attention, is the bowl stirred with a stick in a completely dark room. Two problems at once. Motion, so the water cannot settle. Darkness, so even if it did settle, it could not reflect clearly. This is the mind caught in doubt, not the honest uncertainty that asks real questions and waits for real answers, but the circular, self-undermining doubt that questions everything, including its own capacity to understand. The doubt that does not move toward clarity because it has lost confidence in clarity as a possibility. And now the fourth. The bowl is outside. The water is clean, uncolored, not boiling, not covered. In every observable way it should be clear. But there is wind, not a storm, just wind, consistent and directionless, moving across the surface from every angle at once. The water cannot still itself. Every time the surface begins to smooth, another gust crosses it, breaking the forming stillness before it can complete. The bottom of the bowl is there. The clarity is there, but the surface never settles long enough for any of it to be seen. The Buddha called this restlessness and worry. If you have ever lain in bed with a mind that refuses to stop, not because anything specific is terribly wrong, not because you are angry or exhausted or deeply uncertain, but simply because the surface will not settle. Thought following thought in a chain with no clear beginning and no clear end. You have met this hindrance. It is the most common reason people cannot sleep. Not crisis. Wind. The Buddha was precise about its cause. Restlessness and worry is not produced by having too many problems. It is produced by a mind that has not been given a resting place. A mind with nowhere to settle will keep moving, not because it wants to, but because movement is what minds do when they have not been shown stillness as an alternative. The wind does not choose to disturb the water. It simply keeps moving because nothing has stopped it. Notice what this means for tonight. It means the restlessness you feel is not a sign of something wrong with you. It is not evidence of a mind that is uniquely difficult or damaged or too far from peace to reach it. It is what any mind does when it has not yet found its resting place in this particular night. The bowl is not broken. There is just wind, and wind can stop. In the Pali Canon, the antidote the Buddha gave most directly for this hindrance is composure, the quality of a mind that has returned its attention again and again to a single object until the returning itself becomes more natural than the wandering, not forcing stillness, providing a resting place that the mind can find its way back to each time the wind pulls it elsewhere. You were given that resting place in the last teaching. The practice of goodwill, extended first toward yourself, then outward in all directions, is not only a teaching about compassion, it is a direct antidote to the fourth hindrance. A mind genuinely resting in goodwill has somewhere to be. It is not scanning, not rehearsing, not running its audit of everything unresolved. It has landed. The wind does not stop by force. It stops because the mind has found something warm enough, real enough, and steady enough to rest in. The Buddha also described a quality that arises naturally once restlessness begins to release its hold. He called it tranquility, not the tranquility of a mind that has been forced into submission, but the tranquility that arrives as a natural consequence when the wind stops and the surface finds its own level, a settling that no one engineers. That happens because it was always the water's nature to be still, and the conditions that prevented stillness have finally eased. This tranquility is one of 7 qualities the Buddha identified as the natural companions of an awakening mind. He named them the 7 factors of awakening, and he taught them not only as a map of spiritual development, but as something with immediate, practical, and verifiable power. Power demonstrated not in a teaching hall but at a bedside, at the bedside of a sick monk, and then at the bedside of another, and then in one of the most quietly remarkable moments recorded in the early texts, at the bedside of the Buddha himself when he was ill. In each case, the recitation of the 7 factors produced immediate relief, immediate healing, immediate calm. Right now, the bowl in the wind is slowing, not because you have done anything to stop it, because you have been listening for some time now, and listening with this quality of attention is itself a resting place. The surface is not yet completely still, but the gusts are less frequent than they were an hour ago, and each interval of relative stillness is lasting a little longer. Let the water find its own level. It knows how. It has always known how. What it needed was for the conditions that kept it agitated to ease enough for its own nature to reassert itself. The bowl in the wind settles when the wind stops. The Buddha described 7 specific qualities of mind that, when cultivated, create exactly those conditions, not by force, but by natural resolution. One of them is tranquility. And in a teaching that has been chanted at bedsides for over 2,000 years, the 7 factors were shown to heal what medicine could not. The Buddha was lying down. This detail matters more than it might first appear. He was ill, feverish, physically weakened, the kind of unwell that does not respond to will or discipline or the force of long spiritual practice. A monk named Kunda came to him and asked, with careful respect, whether the Buddha would like to hear the 7 factors of awakening recited aloud. The Buddha said yes. So Kunda recited them, quietly, beside the bed of his teacher, moving through each quality in turn. And the early texts record something that is easy to read past without registering its full weight. Upon hearing the 7 factors, the Buddha recovered. His illness lifted. He rose from his bed. This same account is given twice more in the same collection of teachings. the venerable Mahakasapa, gravely ill, heard the 7 factors recited at his bedside and recovered. The venerable Moggallana, also ill, also recovered upon hearing them. 3 specific instances, preserved without elaboration, of practitioners lying down unwell and rising again after hearing these 7 qualities named aloud in their presence. The tradition that grew from these accounts became one of the most continuous practices in the history of Buddhism. For over 2,000 years, in Theravada communities across Southeast Asia, practitioners have gathered at the bedside of the sick, at the threshold of the night, at the moment when a person lies down and needs the mind to release its grip on the day, and they have recited protective teachings with careful, unhurried attention. The specific texts change by region and occasion. The understanding beneath them does not. Words that carry genuine qualities of mind, spoken with care at the right moment, do something to the person receiving them, not through ritual alone, through the quality of presence they require and the quality of mind they describe. The 7 factors are not a list of achievements to work through in order. They are a description of how the mind naturally moves when conditions allow it to, a sequence that follows its own internal logic, each quality making the ground ready for the next to arise. You do not produce them by effort. You recognize them as they appear, and your recognition allows each one to complete itself before passing naturally to what follows. The first is simply knowing where the mind is, not correcting it, not improving it, just the honest recognition of what is present right now. The weight of the body, the temperature of the air, a thought passing through. Knowing, without judgment or interference, what is actually here. This is where everything begins, because a mind that does not know where it is cannot move deliberately from where it stands. From that knowing, a second quality can arise, a willingness to look more closely at whatever the knowing finds. Not analysis, not the problem-solving mind organizing itself for action. The simple willingness to see what is actually present, rather than reaching past it toward what is feared, or hoped for, or expected. The mind that knows where it is, and then looks honestly at what it finds there, begins to work with what is real. It stops defending against a version of the situation that may not match the situation itself. This is the second quality, and its practical gift is relief, the particular relief of seeing something clearly after a long time of looking away from it. The third is energy, and this word is easily misread. It does not mean effort. It does not mean pushing a tired mind past its natural limits. It means something closer to aliveness, the quality of a mind genuinely engaged with this moment, rather than performing engagement while actually somewhere else. You can feel the difference in your own body right now. The mind forcing itself costs something with every step. The mind genuinely present feeds itself. This third quality is the difference between those two experiences. When knowing, clear seeing, and genuine aliveness are present together, something else arrives without being manufactured. The early texts use a word that translates roughly as rapture, but the English word reaches for more drama than what is meant. It is quieter than rapture, a subtle gladness at simply being alive in this particular moment, not because the moment is exceptional, but because being alive in any moment, when met with full presence, carries a quality of rightness that does not depend on anything outside it. The body notices this before the mind names it. Something loosens somewhere that had been held, perhaps for a long time, without knowing it was being held. And then, naturally, without decision, without instruction, the fifth quality arrives. Tranquility, the settling that follows genuine gladness, the way exhaling follows a breath taken all the way in. The mind that has moved through knowing, clear seeing, aliveness, and quiet gladness finds itself in a place it did not need to create. The bowl from the last teaching, the one the wind kept agitating, begins, without being touched, to smooth its own surface. The conditions that prevented stillness have eased. The stillness that was always the water's nature quietly returns. In that tranquility, composure becomes available in a way it simply was not before. The mind resting in itself, not because it has forced its way into stillness, but because stillness is what remains when the restlessness has finished. There is nowhere the mind needs to be right now. Nothing it has left unguarded. Nothing whose absence it is rehearsing. Nothing waiting at the edge of consciousness to be resolved before rest is permitted. It has arrived, without drama, at what was always available, and simply required the right conditions to recognize. The seventh quality does not need to be pursued. It arrives as the natural completion of the six that came before it. Equanimity, the quality of a mind that can be with what is, fully and without resistance, without requiring this moment to be different from what it actually is. Not indifference, not the flattening of experience into something grey and colourless. A steadiness so complete that whatever arises can move through it without destabilizing what holds it. The practitioner who has reached this quality lies down without carrying unfinished business into the night. The sleep that follows is the sleep the Buddha described, comfortable, clean, and genuinely restorative. Consider what this night has already been doing. A mountain that stayed still through everything the sky threw at it. The recognition that awareness itself is not the thought but the space in which thought moves. The practice of goodwill extended in all directions until the mind had nothing left to guard against. The naming of the exact disturbance most responsible for sleeplessness and the antidote the Buddha prescribed for it. These were not separate teachings placed beside each other. They were conditions being set, one after another, in a sequence that has its own direction. Knowing was being established. Clear seeing was being offered. Genuine aliveness was being invited through the quality of attention this kind of listening asks for. The quiet gladness, the tranquility, the composure, these have been accumulating in the background of everything, whether or not they were named while they were building. The listener who has stayed with this night has been moving through the seven qualities without knowing their names. That is precisely how bedside recitation was always meant to work. not as information to be processed, but as conditions to be entered. The entering has been happening. The conditions are present. Let the seventh quality settle now into whatever space in you has been holding without releasing. This is what Kunda gave the Buddha beside his bed, not a remedy administered from outside. Conditions created through careful, attentive presence, within which the healer that was always available could finally do its work. That same work is available to you right now, in this hour, in whatever position you are lying or resting in, as these words reach you. Equanimity does not mean nothing matters. It means nothing needs to be held with clenched hands, which raises a question that difficulty has always made sharp. What happens when the thing disturbing your peace is not a thought or a fear or an old wound, but a person, a specific, external, consistent person who arrives every single day and makes you wonder whether your peace was ever as stable as you believed? The next teaching begins with exactly that person and with what they were actually there to do. Metal on metal, a rhythm without mercy, beginning before dawn and continuing without pause through the hours of the morning, through the period of afternoon work, and often well into the evening. Not a sound that rises and falls with any consideration for what surrounds it, a constant, indifferent percussion that enters every corner of the temple grounds and makes silence feel like something permanently lost. For a moment, just that sound. No monastery around it, no monk yet disturbed by it. Simply the hammering and whatever response rises in you upon hearing it described, because the response is the teaching. A monk named Jishin had spent 3 years in the temple of still waters, cultivating exactly the kind of practice the name suggested. Early rising, long periods of sitting, the careful tending of a contemplative life built around silence, the way a house is built around its central beam. He had grown genuinely peaceful in those 3 years. His mind had settled into rhythms that felt stable and real. He was not performing calm. He had found it. Then the house next door was purchased by a metalworker named Tanaka, who set up his workshop in the adjoining yard and began his days at a time and volume that suggested complete indifference to the fact that a contemplative community existed 6 meters from his anvil. Within a week, Jishin's practice had collapsed. Not dramatically, gradually, in the way that water finds every crack in a structure that seemed solid. He could not settle into his morning sitting because he was listening for the hammering to begin. When it began, he could not release his resistance to it. When silence occasionally appeared, he could not trust it because he knew it was temporary. He began to resent Tanaka with a consistency and creativity that surprised him. This man he had never spoken to, who was simply conducting a trade in proximity to a community he had no particular reason to accommodate. After a month of this, Jishin went to the temple's head teacher, a man named Echo, with what he believed was a reasonable problem requiring a practical solution. The noise was destroying the atmosphere of practice. Surely something could be done. Surely the community had a right to protect the conditions that made genuine contemplative life possible. Eco listened to all of it. The specific sounds, the timing, the accumulated resentment, the collapsed sittings, the fantasies of intervention. He listened with the patience of someone who has heard many versions of this particular complaint across many decades and recognizes in each one the same underlying question being asked in different clothing. Then he said something that Jishin was not prepared for. What do you think he is here to teach you? Jishin stared at his teacher. The question landed in entirely the wrong place. Tanaka was not here to teach anything. He was here to make metal goods and sell them, and the collateral damage of that enterprise was the destruction of 3 years of careful practice. Eco continued, without waiting for the objection to fully form. You have spent 3 years learning to find peace when the conditions are ideal, when the morning is silent, when the temple is ordered, when nothing outside your control interferes with the interior work. This is a real accomplishment, and I do not diminish it. He paused. But it is not the accomplishment you came here for. The peace that exists only in silence is not yet free. It is dependent on silence, which means silence owns it, not you. Jishin sat with this in a silence that felt different from the silence he had been defending. Your neighbor, Eco said, has arrived at precisely the right moment to show you where your practice ends. This is not misfortune. This is precision. Any student can find stillness when everything cooperates. The question your practice has been building toward, without your knowing it was building toward anything, is whether you can find it when nothing cooperates at all. The Buddha taught this not as an abstraction, but as a precise description of what genuine equanimity actually is. He said a practitioner with a well-developed mind remains stable, whether praised or blamed, whether comfortable or uncomfortable, whether the conditions of a given day are favorable or entirely otherwise. The stability is not produced by the conditions. It exists prior to them, underneath them, as a quality of mind that circumstances can test but cannot create and cannot remove. If it could be removed by a metalworker's hammer, it was never really there. It was borrowed from the silence. Jishin returned to his cushion that evening with something he had not brought to it before, not a hope that the hammering would stop, but a genuine curiosity about what he would find if he stopped fighting it. He settled. The hammering was still there. This time, instead of placing himself against it, he allowed it into the field of his attention alongside everything else: the temperature of the air, the feel of the cushion, the rhythm of his breath. One sound among many, present, real, not requiring a verdict. Something shifted, not immediately, not completely, but enough. The sound had not changed. His relationship to it had, and in that change, he found something his 3 years of quiet practice had been preparing him to find, but could not, by themselves, deliver: a steadiness, that did not require the hammering to stop in order to be real. The Chan master Hongji described this quality as a light that does not select what it illuminates. It falls on everything equally, the beautiful and the difficult, the welcome and the unwelcome, without contracting in the presence of what it would rather not meet. This is not achieved by becoming indifferent to experience. It is what becomes possible when the awareness that observes experience has stopped insisting that experience conform to its preferences before it will remain open. Silent illumination is not the absence of noise. It is the quality of awareness that noise cannot reach. Tanaka eventually moved his workshop to a larger premises several months later. By the time he did, Jishin found he had lost the anxiety about his neighbor's departure that he would have felt earlier. The practice had deepened past the point where it needed the hammering, but it had also deepened past the point where it needed it to stop. What the difficult neighbor teaches is the same thing the river teaches, though from a completely different direction. A king once sat with a monk beside an actual river and asked a question about why action without a fixed self is still action, still intentional, still arriving exactly where it is meant to go. The monk pointed at the water, and the answer was so simple, it took a moment to recognize how complete it was. There is a moment recorded in an ancient dialogue between a Greek king and a Buddhist monk that has survived intact for over 2,000 years, and it begins not with philosophy, but with geography. Two men are sitting together somewhere in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent, in a region where two great civilizations had been colliding and intermingling for generations, producing a culture that thought in Greek and felt in Sanskrit, and asked questions that neither tradition alone could fully answer. The king's name was Milinda. The monk's name was Nagasena. Their dialogue was recorded in a text that has been studied in Theravada communities for centuries as one of the most precise and accessible explorations of Buddhist teaching that exists. What makes it unusual is the king. He was genuinely interested, genuinely sharp, and genuinely resistant to being satisfied with answers that did not hold up under pressure. He brought the interrogating habit of Greek philosophical tradition to a body of teaching that had developed in an entirely different climate of thought, and the friction between them produced something that neither tradition would have produced alone. One of his questions concerned action. If there is no fixed, permanent self, if what we call a person is actually a collection of constantly changing processes without a stable center, then who is acting? Who is making the decision, taking the step, directing the intention? And if there is no one there in the way we ordinarily assume there is someone there, how can action be genuine? How can it be wise? How can it arrive anywhere at all? Nagasena did not answer immediately with doctrine. He pointed at the nearest river. "Watch it," he said. "Watch how it moves." The river does not plan its route. It does not consult a map or calculate the most efficient path to the sea. It has no fixed center that makes decisions about direction, and yet it always arrives. Without exception, without failure, across any terrain and through any obstacle, the water finds its way from its source to the sea with a consistency that no planned route could improve upon. When it encounters a boulder, it does not stop to assess the situation. It does not waste energy pushing against what will not move. It finds the passage of least resistance, not because it is lazy, not because it has given up, but because moving around is always more efficient than forcing through. The boulder remains. The river continues. Both are exactly what they are, and neither is diminished by the encounter. When it enters a wide valley, it does not accelerate unnecessarily, does not push itself to maintain the speed of the narrow gorge it just left. It spreads, slows, takes the shape of the available space with complete ease. When the valley narrows again, it gathers and quickens without complaint. It adjusts to every condition with the same fundamental nature, intact throughout every adjustment. It is always, unmistakably, a river, and it always, eventually, reaches the sea. This, said Nagasena, is how wise action moves through the world. Not the absence of intention. The river is entirely intentional, in the sense that it never stops moving toward where it is going. Not the absence of effort. The river exerts enormous force when force serves its movement, and none when it does not. Not passivity or surrender or the abandonment of direction. The precise application of movement to circumstance, without the interference of a fixed self that insists circumstances should be other than what they are before movement is allowed to proceed. Melinda pressed further. If the river has no fixed self making its decisions, is the water arriving at the sea the same water that left the mountain? Nagasena smiled. Is the flame burning now the same flame that was burning an hour ago? The king considered this. Not the same, not different, a continuity that is real without being fixed, a process with direction and integrity and genuine arrival, requiring no unchanging center to make any of that possible. Most people relate to their own lives the way a person might try to carry a river in a bucket. They take a fixed container, a fixed idea of who they are, what they need, what must happen before things can be acceptable, and try to pour the movement of life into it. The river does not fit. It never fits. And the effort of trying to make it fit is the source of an exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much work the day actually required. The Buddhist teaching that Nagasena was illustrating says this with precision. Suffering arises not from circumstances, but from the addition of a fixed self that insists circumstances be otherwise. Remove the insistence and the circumstances remain exactly what they are, sometimes difficult, sometimes easy, always changing, but the suffering that the insistence was generating disappears with it. The river still encounters boulders. It simply does not suffer them. This is not a teaching about becoming someone who does not care what happens. The river cares profoundly about arriving. It never stops caring. It simply does not confuse caring about arrival with needing every individual obstacle to not be an obstacle. These are two completely different relationships to difficulty, and only one of them allows continuous forward movement. Consider what you have been trying to carry in a fixed container today. The specific outcome you needed from a situation that moved differently. The conversation that was supposed to go one way and went another. The plan that the day simply did not cooperate with, despite all the reasonable preparation that went into it. Each of these is a boulder the river encountered. The boulder is real. The river's job was never to make the boulder disappear, only to keep moving. You are still moving. The fact that you are here, in this hour, having moved through everything today asked of you, and arrived at this moment of rest, this is the river reaching a quiet part of the valley, wider, slower, still entirely itself, still entirely arriving. The river does not carry yesterday's boulders with it. It encounters them, moves around them, and continues. What stays behind, in the carrying, is not the boulder itself, but the insistence that the boulder should not have been there. And insistence, unlike water, does not move. It sits in the chest and the jaw, and the hours between midnight and morning, and it waits to see how long you will carry it before setting it down. The next teaching asks exactly that question, not about the boulder, but about how long you have been holding it, and whether the holding was ever required at all. Draw a line on water. Right now, in your mind, run a finger across the surface of a still pool and watch what happens. The line forms for a fraction of a second, a thin disturbance, a parting of the surface, and then closes behind itself as though the finger was never there. No mark, no trace. The water returns to itself so completely and so immediately that the idea of a permanent line on water becomes almost absurd. Water does not hold. It is not in its nature to hold. Now draw a line on sand. This one stays. You can see it clearly. Follow its length. Read the intention behind it. But leave it overnight, and the wind will have worked on it. A week of weather, and it is gone. The sand rearranged into perfect indifference to whatever was once written across it. The line on sand outlasts the moment, but not the season. Now draw a line on stone. A chisel, or years of water, moving always in the same direction, or the slow insistence of a root finding the same crack over decades. This line stays. It outlasts the person who made it. It outlasts the memory of why it was made. Long after the hand that drew it has turned to earth, the line remains in the stone, unchanged and unchanging. The Buddha asked his monks to consider these three surfaces and then honestly answer one question. When someone speaks harshly to you, where do you hold the mark they leave? In water, where it closes before the moment ends. In sand, where it lasts for a while but the weather eventually handles it. Or in stone, where it remains across years, where you can return to it at any time and find it exactly as sharp and present as the day it was cut. Most people do not choose which surface they are. They simply discover, over time, by noticing what they are still carrying. The teaching this comes from is one of the most demanding in the entire Pali Canon. The Buddha did not offer it gently. He told his monks that even if someone were to attack them with a saw, literally, with a physical saw, the moment any ill will arose in response, that moment, the teaching had been lost. The standard he set was water, not forgiveness as an act of will, not the suppression of natural feeling, not a performance of equanimity the body does not match, the actual quality of a mind that does not retain the mark, that closes behind the difficulty, like water closes behind a moving hand. This sounds, when stated plainly, impossible. And the Buddha was not naive about human nature. He would not have used such an extreme example if he did not understand the full distance between what he was describing and where most people stand. He was not saying, "Achieve this immediately, or you have failed." He was pointing at the destination clearly enough that the direction could not be mistaken. And the direction is always the same, toward less holding, not more. Towards sand, if stone is where you are now. Toward water, when sand becomes possible. Think of something from today that left a mark, an interaction that landed wrong, a word from someone that has been sitting in your chest since it was delivered, a moment that played back in your mind more than once during the hours that followed. You do not need to name it aloud. You know what it is. Now ask honestly, what surface is this mark sitting in? If it is still sharp, still vivid, still producing the same response it produced at the moment of impact, that is stone, not as a judgment, as information, because stone can be worked. Stone is not permanent, just because it is hard. Water gets through stone eventually. It just requires patience and a consistent direction. The moment the harsh word was spoken, something real happened. Contact was made. The first arrow landed, as the earlier teaching named it. That moment is not in question and not being dismissed. The question is only about what has happened since, because the word itself ended at the moment of its utterance. The person who spoke it has moved through many other moments since then. They are not still speaking it. They may not be thinking of it at all. The only place it is still happening is in you, in the holding, in the returning to it, in the way a part of the mind keeps taking it out and looking at it as though looking hard enough will resolve something that looking cannot resolve. The Buddha called what accumulates in the stone surface of the mind agata, a word that carries the sense of something striking repeatedly against the same place. Not the original blow, but the repeated revisiting of it. The suffering in agata is not caused by the original event. It is caused by the returning, by treating a completed past moment as though it were still active and still requiring a response. The way out of stone is not to pretend the mark was never made. It is to stop returning to it, Each time the mind begins its familiar path back to the stored injury, it has a choice, not a grand, dramatic choice, requiring enormous willpower, but the small, consistent choice of the river moving around a boulder rather than stopping to push against it. Acknowledge. Do not return. Let the wind and the weather work on the sand version rather than reinforcing the stone one. There is a particular kind of carrying that happens at night. The daylight hours offer enough motion and distraction that the things being carried can stay at the edge of awareness. But when the body lies down and the outer world quiets, everything that has been carried moves to the center. The marks on stone become the only light in the room. This is why the quality of what we are holding when we lie down matters so completely, not because the night is uniquely dangerous, but because it is uniquely honest. What we carry into the dark is what the dark will show us. Tonight, consider moving from stone towards sand, not by forcing yourself to feel differently, by choosing once not to return to the mark and retrace it. Let it sit without visiting it. Let the weather work. The mark does not disappear in a single night, but each night that passes without the returning makes the stone a little less like stone and a little more like sand. And eventually, if the practice holds, like water, the mind that carries marks into the dark creates threats from shadows. The same mechanism that turns a grievance into a stone inscription also turns an unknown sound into a danger and a future uncertainty into a catastrophe. The next teaching goes directly into a forest at night, not to frighten, but to show what a trained mind actually finds when it stops running and turns to look. A sound arrives in the forest. The Buddha does not move. He is sitting at the base of a large tree, in a location he chose specifically because it frightens him, one of the charnel grounds, the deep forest clearings, the isolated gullies that the ordinary person avoids after dark, without needing to explain why. He has been sitting here for hours. The darkness is complete, except for what the moon manages through the canopy. And now, a sound. He turns toward it. Not figuratively, physically, deliberately, he turns his body in the direction of the sound and looks. A deer, standing at the edge of the clearing, regarding him with the calm curiosity of an animal that has not yet decided whether to be alarmed. It turns and disappears into the trees. The clearing returns to silence. He returns to his sitting. Another sound arrives. He turns toward it again. A branch settling under its own weight in the cooling night air. The kind of slow creak that wood makes when temperature changes, that sounds in darkness like something deliberate and approaching. A branch. He returns to sitting. This is what the Buddha described in a teaching he gave early in his ministry, the specific practice he had developed of sitting alone in genuinely frightening places and turning toward every sound that fear tried to make him run from. He described it in detail, the locations he chose, the fear that arose reliably at the beginning of each night, the way it manifested in the body, hair standing, breath shortening, the particular alertness of an organism that believes it is about to need to act. And then the practice, turning toward the sound before the mind could complete its story about what the sound meant. Every time he turned toward the sound, he found what was actually there. A peacock dislodging a branch, wind moving through bamboo in a pattern that the frightened mind reads as footsteps, an animal moving through dry leaves. Again and again, what the darkness contained was ordinary. What the mind was generating in response to the darkness was not. The teaching he drew from this is precise and practical. Fear, in the vast majority of cases, is not a response to what is actually present. It is a response to what the mind believes is present, to the story assembled from incomplete information in the dark. The sound arrives. The mind, working faster than investigation can follow, produces an interpretation, something dangerous, something threatening, something requiring immediate protective action. The body responds to the interpretation, not the sound. The heart accelerates. The muscles tighten. The whole organism goes on to alert. For a deer, for a branch, for wind through bamboo. What the Buddha developed in those forest sittings was a different sequence. Sound arrives. Fear begins to form. Before the fear completes, before the story solidifies into certainty, turn and look. Not with the braced, defensive looking of someone expecting the worst, with the open, steady attention of someone genuinely interested in what is actually there. Investigation before interpretation. The actual thing before the mind's version of the thing. He also described, without self-congratulation, the moments when he failed, when fear completed its journey before investigation could interrupt, when he rose and moved away from the sound before turning toward it. Each time, he returned to sit in the same location the following night. The practice was not the achievement of fearlessness in a single sitting. It was the consistent returning, night after night, to the habit of turning toward rather than away. The results were cumulative. Each time investigation replaced interpretation, and each time it found something ordinary where fear had predicted something dangerous, the mind's confidence in its own fear predictions weakened slightly. The hair still stood, the breath still shortened, but the second movement, the one where the mind builds its catastrophe on top of the physical sensation, became slower, more hesitant, less automatic. The gap between the sound and the story widened, and in that gap, investigation had room to work. This is the capacity the Buddha was describing when he said a practitioner with a well-trained mind can sit alone in the wilderness and remain stable through the night. Not because the frightening sounds stop, not because the body stops registering them, because the mind no longer completes the journey from sensation to catastrophe automatically. Investigation interrupts that journey every time it is applied, and what it finds, again and again, in every forest, across every dark night is the ordinary. The nighttime fears that most people carry are not forest fears. They live in the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning, assembling themselves from fragments of the day, a comment that might have meant something, a project whose outcome is uncertain, a relationship whose direction is unclear, a future that has not yet arrived and is being experienced in advance, in its worst possible form. These are the sounds in your forest. The mind, working in the dark with incomplete information, building its stories about what they mean. The practice is the same. When the fear thought arrives tonight, pause before the story completes. Turn toward it with genuine curiosity rather than defensive readiness. Ask, what is actually here? Not what might be here, not what this could become. What is specifically, concretely present in this moment? Most of the time, the honest answer is less than the mind was building, a sound in the canopy, a branch settling, a deer. Fear cannot survive a clear look for very long, not because clear looking defeats fear, but because fear is almost always a story about something not yet present, and clear looking returns the mind to what is actually here, which is almost always survivable, and often simply ordinary. The Buddha sat in those dark forests until the night no longer required anything of him that he could not meet. The darkness did not change. What changed was his relationship to whatever it contained, no longer a theater for the mind's worst productions, but simply where he was, in this moment, with whatever was actually here. What the forest teaches through stillness, the storm teaches through force. The next teaching takes place on the night before the worst storm in living memory arrives, inside a great forest where 2 kinds of trees are about to demonstrate, with no room for argument, which quality of being survives when nothing can be held upright by will alone. The tree spirits are arguing. This is how the oldest version of this story begins. Not with a storm, not with destruction, not with any of the dramatic imagery that the ending will earn, but with voices disagreeing in the canopy of a great forest on an ordinary afternoon, before the sky has given any indication of what is coming. The disagreement is about a simple question. And the question is this: when the storm arrives, what should we do? The spirits of the large trees answer first. Their confidence is the confidence of things that have stood for centuries, the unhurried certainty of beings whose roots reach deeper than memory, whose trunks have widened past the span of human arms. We will stand firm, they say. We will not move. We have weathered every storm that has passed through this valley, and we will weather this one. To yield would be to lose what we are. The spirits of the smaller trees speak more quietly. We will bend, they say. When the wind comes, we will go with it. As far as it takes us, as low as it pushes us. And when it passes, we will return to where we were. The large trees find this answer unimpressive. It sounds, to them, like surrender dressed in careful language. The small trees have always been small. Perhaps they have simply found a philosophy that accommodates their limitation. The storm arrives before the argument is resolved. It comes the way the worst storms come, with a preliminary stillness so complete that every creature in the forest pauses, some ancient instinct recognizing what the silence means. Then the wind begins. Not gradually, not with any courtesy of escalation. It arrives at full force, as though it has been gathering its intention somewhere out at sea for days, and has finally found its target. The canopy tears and lifts. Rain arrives sideways, horizontal, with the density of something solid. The temperature drops in minutes. The forest, which was still a moment ago, is now a single continuous roar. The large trees do exactly what they said they would do. They stand firm. They push back against the wind with everything their centuries have given them, the full weight of their accumulated growth, the depth of their root systems, the mass and solidity that have defined them. For a time this works. They hold. They do not move. They are precisely what they believe themselves to be. And then the wind finds the limit of what holding can accomplish. The roots, which reach deep but do not spread widely, which go down in search of water rather than out in search of stability, begin to give way beneath the sustained lateral force. The trunk, which has grown to resist its own weight and the weight of its canopy, but has never learned to be anything other than vertical, cracks under a load it was not designed to carry. One by one the great trees fall, not from weakness, but from a kind of strength that did not know how to be anything other than itself, when what the moment required was something different. The small trees bend. They bend until their crowns brush the ground, until any observer would say they are finished, until the bending looks indistinguishable from breaking. Their roots, which spread wide and shallow through the soil, hold precisely because they hold in every direction equally, no single direction bearing the full force of the storm, the load distributed through an underground network that the wind cannot reach. They are not resisting, they are receiving, taking the full force of the storm into their bodies and allowing it to move through them rather than meeting it with a counterforce that the storm will simply exceed. When the storm passes, the small trees stand. Slowly, without ceremony, they return to vertical, each one rising back to where it was, as though nothing remarkable has happened, as though going all the way down and returning all the way up is simply part of what a tree does. The forest floor around them is covered with the fallen bodies of the great trees. The small trees stand among the wreckage, unchanged. The Bodhisattva, the being who would eventually become the Buddha in one of his many previous lives, was a tree spirit in this forest, and the teaching he drew from what he witnessed was preserved in the Jataka tales. What appears as strength is brittleness. What appears as surrender is the most complete form of survival available. Only what yields to what it cannot change will still be standing when the wind has finished. This is a teaching about flexibility, but it is important to understand what flexibility means here, because it is easily misread as weakness, or as the absence of principle. The small trees did not become less themselves by bending. They were rooted throughout, their underground network held through every degree of their bending, which is precisely why they could return to vertical when the bending was no longer required. Flexibility without roots is not the teaching. The teaching is roots deep enough that the surface can move freely without anything essential being lost. Think of where in your own life you have been standing firm in the manner of the large trees, the position you will not move from, the outcome you will not release, the version of how something should be that you are holding against a reality that keeps insisting otherwise. The wind is not personal. It does not know it is pushing against you specifically. It is simply what is. And what is, held against with sufficient rigidity, will eventually find the limit of the holding. The Buddhist teaching on the middle way is sometimes misunderstood as a teaching about moderation, about finding the acceptable midpoint between extremes. But the middle way is not about avoiding the edges. It is about having roots deep enough that you can visit both edges without being destroyed by either. You can bend fully without losing what you are. You can yield without surrendering your direction. The small tree goes all the way to the ground and comes all the way back. It does not compromise its bending or its returning. It does both completely. Tonight, whatever you have been holding rigid can be allowed to bend. The roots will hold. They have held through every storm you have already survived, and those storms were real, and you are here. Bending now is not losing what you are. It is trusting that what you are runs deeper than any position the surface is currently defending. The trees bent all the way to the ground and found the ground waiting to receive them, which points toward what this entire night has been moving through its teachings to uncover, the thing that has been waiting beneath every story, every difficulty, every hour of searching. A woman spent her whole life sitting directly above it without knowing it was there. And what she found, when she finally dug where she had always stood, was not something new. It was what had always been there, patient, inexhaustible, requiring only the one act she had never thought to perform. Every night of her life, the woman came home to the same hut. She knew its floor the way you know the face of someone you have lived beside for decades. Every uneven stone, every place where the boards creaked, every corner where the cold came through in winter. She had swept that floor thousands of times. She had sat on it, slept on it, eaten on it, wept on it. It was, in the way that familiar things become invisible, simply the ground beneath her, present and unnoticed, there and unseen. She was not a woman without intelligence or care. She managed her small life with the particular competence of someone who has learned to make much from little. But the years were hard in the way that ordinary years are hard. Not catastrophic, not marked by dramatic suffering, simply the steady weight of a life, lived close to its edges. Never quite enough. Always the quiet strain of a person whose resources fall slightly short of what the day requires. A wandering monk stopped at her door one afternoon, one of those practitioners who had developed, through long years of meditation, a quality of perception that most people never encounter. He looked at the woman. He looked at the hut. And he saw something she had never seen in all her years of living there. Beneath the floor, he told her, is a treasury, gold, not a small amount, not a modest reserve, but something inexhaustible, enough for every need she had ever carried, enough for every need she would ever carry. It has been here your whole life, he said. Dig where you have always stood. She did not entirely believe him. The claim was too large, too improbable, too directly contrary to everything her experience had taught her about her own situation. People who have lived for years in a particular story about themselves do not release that story at a stranger's word, even when the stranger is calm, even when something in his presence makes the claim feel less like fantasy than it should. But she dug, because the cost of being wrong was only the effort of digging, and the cost of not trying was another year of the same insufficiency she already knew. What she found when the floor opened, when the familiar ground she had stood on and dismissed and never once questioned gave way to what lay beneath it, undid her completely. Not with joy, not immediately, with the particular shock of a person discovering that the story they have been living inside was wrong in the most fundamental possible direction. She had not been poor in a poor hut. She had been rich, living in complete ignorance of her own wealth, suffering a poverty that was always and entirely a matter of not knowing what she possessed. The Mahayana Buddhist tradition, the branch of Buddhism that spread through Central Asia, China, Tibet, Korea, and Japan, contains a teaching that uses exactly this image. A poor woman living above an inexhaustible treasury, unaware of what she stands on. The treasury, in the teaching, is not metaphorical gold. It is what the tradition calls Buddha nature, the fundamental, unborn, undiminished quality of awareness that every sentient being already possesses, that cannot be damaged by any experience, that is not increased by spiritual achievement and not decreased by moral failure, that is simply there, complete, present, and inexhaustible beneath every layer of confusion and suffering and searching. The teaching says something that is either the most radical claim in the history of Buddhist thought or the most obvious observation imaginable, depending on whether you have touched it. You are not working toward something you do not have. You are working toward the recognition of something you have always had. The searching is real. The suffering is real. But they are the suffering of a person who has not yet dug where they have always been standing, not the suffering of someone who is genuinely without. This is why every teaching this night has pointed in the same direction. The mountain was not showing you something you needed to build. It was showing you something already present in you, that the storm had temporarily obscured. The sky was not a state to achieve. It was the nature of the awareness you have always been using to watch your thoughts. The goodwill the Buddha asked you to extend toward yourself was not a quality you had to manufacture. It was what remained when the self-criticism briefly stopped and the natural ground of the mind became available. Every tradition that has preserved the Buddha's teaching across every culture it has moved through arrives eventually at this same recognition from a different direction. The Theravada tradition describes a state of consciousness, the life continuum, that underlies every experience, including dreamless sleep, the mind's natural resting baseline, clear and undisturbed, visited every night by every person who has ever lived. The Tibetan tradition calls it the clear light, the luminous, undivided awareness that sleep yoga practitioners train themselves to recognize at the threshold between waking and rest. The Zen tradition points at it with silence, with the pause after the question, the space where the seeking mind stops and something else becomes briefly visible. Different languages, the same floor, the same treasury, the same instruction. Dig where you have always stood. You have been standing in this place your entire life. Every difficult night, every hour of searching in the wrong direction, every moment of genuine rest you have ever known, the ones that arrived without explanation, when the mind briefly released its grip and something underneath became available. Those moments were not accidents. They were the treasury briefly making itself known through the floor. The monk did not give the woman anything she did not already have. He gave her the direction of her own attention. He pointed down rather than outward. He said, "Here, not elsewhere. Now, not later. This ground, not some other ground." The teaching for tonight is identical. The peace that has been promised in this video's title, the quieted mind, the deep sleep, is not waiting to be constructed from these teachings. It is waiting to be recognized. The recognition does not require more effort. It requires less. The releasing of whatever is still being gripped. The willingness to be, for this night, exactly where you already are. The woman did not have to travel anywhere to find her treasury. She had to stop treating the ground beneath her as something to stand on without question, and begin to understand that what she stood on was precisely where everything she needed had always been waiting. The mind has a resting place it returns to every single night without knowing its own name. Tonight you have simply learned to recognize it. And as this night finds its final threshold, as the teachings settle and the searching quiets, and the floor reveals what was always beneath it, there is one image left, one that has been present in the sky above every story this night has told, waiting to be seen clearly now that the water has finally stilled. The mountain is still there. Across the valley, through every hour of this night, it has not moved once. The storms that passed through it left no permanent mark. They never do. For over 2,000 years, practitioners in Theravada lands have recited protective teachings before sleep, not as magic, but as exactly what this night has been. The deliberate creation of a quality of mind that feels safe enough to finally rest. You have received that same protection tonight, in a different form, through the same intention. Everything this night carried has been pointing at one thing: the mountain's stillness, the sky that holds without gripping, the lamp that burns for whoever needs it, the anger left with its owner, the arrows that fell short, the garden tended before dawn, the fear invited to sit down, the woman who finally dug where she had always stood. All of it pointing here, to this moment, to this breath, to the ground that was always beneath you. The mind has a resting place it returns to every single night. You have been returning to it your whole life without knowing its name. Tonight you know. Look up, not down. The moon you have been searching for was never in the water. It has been in the sky above every story this night told. Unchanged, unhurried, asking nothing of you except that you stop reaching and simply look. Rest now. The teaching is complete. The mountain remains. And you, exactly as you are, exactly where you are already home.